Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. In the midst of all the quarterback arguments I hear about the Browns taking one potentially at 2, I never hear anybody who is on the pro-draft day quarterback side of this argument answer this simple question. Has reaching for a quarterback ever worked out? If you didn't hear me, I'll ask the question again. Come closer. Has reaching for a quarterback in the top 3, in the top 5, I'll expand it. Let's make it top 5. Has reaching for a quarterback in the top 5 of a draft, does that have a long, storied track record of success? Can we think of any successes? Now, there might be some questions you need answered in order to come to an answer on that, right? Like, first question is, how do we even determine what a reach is, right? There's going to be varying definitions on what a reach is, and people are going to kind of default to vibes. But if we're talking about quarterback in the Brown situation, I think there's a pretty simple definition for what a reach is. A reach, for all intents and purposes, for what we are talking about today, drafting a quarterback at 2, is when you take a player in the top 5 of the draft and that player is consistently or consensusly ranked outside the top 10 of most big boards. That, to me, is a reach. If you're taking a player at 2 who's not even one of the 10 best prospects in that draft, simply because he plays the quarterback position. Now, what big boards did I use to come to this consensus? I use the big boards that everybody is publicly familiar with, right? ESPN, we're talking about Todd McShay and Mel Kiper's big boards. Daniel Jeremiah has been a fixture at the NFL Network. Basically, any big board that you see when you're watching the draft has been accounted for in this micro study that I'm doing about reaching on a quarterback. We also have respected draft veterans. Matt Miller, right, for the longest time was the Bleacher Report default, but now he works for ESPN as Todd McShay has left, so he's also replaced Todd McShay in recent years. Pro Football Focus is another outlet that people go to get their draft opinions. So basically, what makes up the main popular consciousness for where players are ranked on their big boards? Now, I'm not saying that these big boards have a 100% hit rate. There are times, like in 2023, where the consensus guy at number 1 was Bryce Young, but CJ Stroud ended up being the better quarterback of the 2. The big boards get it wrong sometimes. But if we look at 10 years of data, what we do know is that the track record for teams taking a quarterback in the top 5 who is not ranked in the top 10 of prospects has not been great, right? It's not 100% of the time that if a prospect is taken in the top 5 and he's a top 10 prospect in that year's class, that quarterback works out. But the quarterbacks that do work out that are drafted in the top 5 are usually consensus top 10 prospects in that year's draft class. So let's look at the data. Let's go through it year by year. We got 10 years of mock drafts, 10 years of big boards to look at. And again, another distinction here, I don't care where these guys had those guys mocked. We're not talking about that. Like, where somebody's mocked, that's based on what these guys are hearing or what these guys think will happen in the draft. I'm talking about what these guys think of these prospects compared to the other prospects in the draft. That's why I only care about big board. That's how you could determine what a reach is. All right, so in 2014, the only quarterback who was taken in the top 5 of that year's class was Blake Bortles. Blake Bortles was pretty consistently ranked outside the top 10. Hell, I didn't find anybody who had him in the top 15. I'm sure there was somebody, but he was pretty much from these mainstream sources, 20th 21st from Matt Miller. Mel Kiper had him at 17. And then Todd McShay had him at 18. He goes number 3 overall. You guys tell me in chat, do you think Blake Bortles was a successful number 3 pick? Now, you could argue they could have went with Derek Carr here, but we're talking about reaching for a quarterback in the top 5, a very specific scenario that people are advocating the Cleveland Browns do, while knowing that taking a quarterback at 2 would be characterized as a reach by most people, given how the consensus is shaping on these prospects. But Blake Bortles, they take him at 3. He was not a top 10 prospect in that year's class. Ends the way it ends. I think the best case scenario that has been presented is actually Carson Wentz, who was a consensus 14th ranked prospect, right? Some places had him in the top 10. Daniel Jeremiah had him number 7 with Goff number 8. Carson Wentz was 14th in Pro Football Focus, 34th by Matt Miller, 7th by Mel Kiper, 10th by Todd McShay. So there was some in and out about where Carson Wentz stood. A lot of this had to do with Carson Wentz being a FCS prospect at the time, right? He was the first guy from the FCS that was being considered to be taken that early in the draft. This was a very new concept, him being out of North Dakota, which I think led to a lot of the variance that we saw in where he was ranked on big boards, because depending on who you talk to, some people just saw the traits and said, hey, he could play. Some people worried about the level of competition and decided that he was not a direction they want to go to. So clearly a different than average situation here. Both Shador and Cam Ward are both FBS prospects, obviously, and both of them played in power conferences with automatic bids to the playoffs. So little bit of a different situation, obviously. But Wentz, probably the best quarterback to be consensus ranked outside the top 10, be drafted super early. And even then, we're talking about a player whose peak was super short and was not the long-term answer for the Philadelphia Eagles. And hell, the Eagles even won a Super Bowl without him at quarterback, with Nick Foles there. And then very shortly after, decide to move on from Carson Wentz entirely. So that's like the best that we have in 10 years here, is Carson Wentz. Spoiler warning, it doesn't get much better from here. Mitch Trubisky was number 2 overall in 2017. Again, another top 5 reach, was the only top 5 reach at quarterback at the time. Daniel Jeremiah was very low on him, had him at 31. PFF staff had him at number 8. Matt Miller, 14. Mel Kiper, 19. Todd McShay, 27, and made for an average of about 19 among the 5 big boards here. He was selected super early. It did not work out. Again, which tells you when you reach, it does not have a history of working out. It's never really worked out. Let's go Baker Mayfield here. There's a lot of variance here. People were concerned that year about Baker Mayfield's height, his play style, and his overall tools compared to more toolsy guys like Sam Darnold. So Baker Mayfield is somebody who just made the top 10 on the average, right? Was number 13th by Daniel Jeremiah, number 1 by Pro Football Focus, number 12 by Matt Miller, number 12 by Mel Kiper and Todd McShay, number 11th by Todd. Averages out to 10 because he got that number 1 ranking from Pro Football Focus, which did do a great deal of lifting here for him. You could debate whether Carson Wentz, who did get some MVP buzz at his peak, or Baker Mayfield is the best case scenario, but that's what you're looking at for best case scenario when you reach for a quarterback. And even then, Baker Mayfield still makes it as a top 10 average guy in these mocks. So I'm not in these mocks, but in these big boards, with Sam Darnold being 5. Again, the big boards aren't always right. Baker Mayfield is better than Sam Darnold. So they were wrong about that. And again, the reason I don't have every other quarterback from the draft class here is we're talking about guys who were taken in the top 5, not guys who were just taken in the first round. We're talking about, again, I feel the need to be very repetitive about this just so the point goes home. We're talking about quarterbacks who are taken in the top 5 that are considered reaches for the top 5. does that work, right? If you want to say somebody was a reach for pick 10, that's a whole different conversation. But if we're talking about in the top 5, it's a very different conversation. How does reaching at quarterback in the top 5 usually work out for these teams? The answer is it has not. And even for the example with Baker Mayfield, it didn't work out for the Browns. It worked out for Tampa Bay, who did not take him number 1 overall that year. So even more to say why you should not do it. And even with all that considered, Baker Mayfield, again, top 10 average throughout these mocks because he got a really high grade from Pro Football Focus. Kyler Murray, number 11 from Daniel Jeremiah. He was the only quarterback that was taken in the top 5 of 2019. Number 1 by Pro Football Focus staff. Number 13th by Matt Miller. 6th by Mel Kiper. 9th by Todd McShay. A consensus number 8 guy in these big boards. So top 10 guy, taken number 1 overall. You can debate whether this has worked out or not, but we know that guys who are in the top 10, like Joe Burrow, right, that obviously worked out for Cincinnati. He was a consensus number 2 guy in that draft class. Tua, consensus number 5 guy in that draft class. Both those guys have gotten extensions with their current team. Same as Kyler Murray. Again, it doesn't hit all the time. You're going to see stuff like Sam Darnold in there. You're going to see stuff like Trey Lance in this draft class and Zach Wilson in there. But the quarterbacks that have worked out for the teams that drafted them, usually top 10 prospects in the draft that they're taking in the top 5. Not usually, always. Sorry, I'm being too fair. Always top 10 quarterbacks in the draft that they're taking when you take that quarterback in the top 5. It's something to consider. Trevor Lawrence is pretty much a consensus 1 guy. He got his extension with the Jacksonville Jaguars. This class was a bit overhyped. I think people were hopeful for it, right? But still, Zach Wilson, number 4, was he the consensus 5th guy in that draft class? Trey Lance was the consensus top 10 guy, was 10 here, 13th here, 12th here, 10th, and 7th. So Trey Lance sat around the top 10 here. So obviously only Trevor Lawrence worked out. Again, just because he's a top 10 prospect consensus does not guarantee success at the quarterback position. But reaching has not produced success for the teams that have drafted in the top 10. All right, 2022, no quarterbacks were taken in the top 10. Kenny Pickett was the only quarterback taken in the first round. He was a consensus number 28th guy. 2023 was another one where you had 3 quarterbacks go in the top 5 of the draft. Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, Anthony Richardson. Bryce Young was pretty much the consensus 1 guy. He was either 1 or 2 on most people's big boards. He had a consensus rating of number 1 amongst these 5 mock drafts. C.J. Stroud was consensus number 5, went from 7 here from Daniel Jeremiah. Pro Football Focus had him at 6. Number 4 here for Matt Miller. Number 5 here for Mel Kiper. Todd McShay had him at number 5 here as well. So that averaged out to number 5. Anthony Richardson was a bit more fluctuation there, right? Number 11, number 16, number 7, number 10. And he averaged out to an 11 ranking. Unironically, he's the one quarterback out here who looks the least promising as they enter their 3rd year of the NFL career. Bryce Young has showed some promise at the end of his 2nd year. C.J. Stroud obviously showing a ton of promise. Anthony Richardson's the big question mark of the 3 in this class, which is a surprise because Bryce Young was looking really bad for a while. But again, being in the top 10 does not guarantee success at drafting a quarterback, right? There's still going to be risk no matter what. But if you're reaching for a guy outside the top 10 of prospects, it has not worked out. Let's go to 2024, right? This is the one people use Jaden Daniels as this example of like, you could do it, but that's just not true. Jaden Daniels was a consensus 10 guy. Daniel Jeremiah had Jaden Daniels number 6. There was outliers like Pro Football Focus had him at 21, but then you had Matt Miller, number 5. Jaden Daniels was number 2 by Mel Kiper. The ESPN staff big board, because Todd McShay, this is the year he got fired from ESPN or quit from ESPN. So we're going to go with the Scouts Inc. Consensus mock that they used on the broadcast that year. He was number 5 on their prospect list, averaging out Jaden to about an average of 8, with that one number 21 ranking doing a lot of lifting there. So clearly Jaden was in the top 10 of prospects by the start of the draft here by most big boards. So he was not a reach at 2 at all. Again, if you're within the top 10 of prospects, I don't consider you a reach at 2. Drake May was a consensus 6 guy, pretty much was number 2 to Caleb Williams throughout most of the rankings here. Caleb Williams looks like he's going to be fine in the NFL. He's not the electrifying superstar he was in college. Jaden Daniels looks like a superstar. Drake May, all these guys, consensus top 10 players in their draft class. Now let's go to 2025. You know, let me zoom in for you guys so we can get a clear picture of what it is that I am talking about here. Let's go to 2025, right? Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. Daniel Jeremiah has Cam Ward, number 10, Shedeur 15. Pro Football Focus has Cam Ward 20th, Shedeur 45. Matt Miller has him out the top 10, 13, Shedeur 22. Mel Kiper higher on these quarterbacks, right? 5 with Shedeur Sanders, 6 with Cam Ward. Todd McShay has him at 10 and Shedeur at 17. And then the last mock draft average puts Cam Ward at 12 and Shedeur at 17. So both of these prospects, if they were taken in the top 5, would be considered reaches, in my opinion, because they're not top 10 prospects in the draft class that they would be selected in, which means that their outcome is more likely to be along the lines of Carson Wentz, of Mitchell Trubisky, of Blake Bortles. This does not have a long history of working out. The only player I think that's been out the top 10 that got a contract, the second contract with the team that selected him, is Carson Wentz. And that was a contract that the Eagles went on to almost immediately regret. Blake Bortles got a second contract that they regretted too. My bad. Let me not disrespect Blake Bortles, former conference championship game participant here. But both those guys were able to get a second contract. I don't think anybody's going into this draft and thinking, hey, man, if we can get Blake Bortles, if we can get Carson Wentz. But that is the statistical reality of what you are asking the Browns to do. If you take Cam Ward, that would be, or Shedeur, this would be the biggest reach in the top 5 since Mitchell Trubisky. That does not feel like a good strategy to me, right? Now, we'll see where these big boards end up by the end of the year, because I'm comparing all these. These are like the final big boards for all these guys those years. Right now, we're comparing big boards that are happening before the start of the combine. Maybe these big boards change dramatically in favor of Cam and Shedeur. Maybe they start to tilt the other direction. Draft usually tells us that the further away we get from the season, the lower and lower these big boards tend to get on quarterbacks, right? Teddy Bridgewater is a giant example of this in 2014. Ended it the season as like number 2 on Mel Kiper's board. By the time we got to the draft, he was like 29. So usually teams and draft pundits tend to get colder on quarterbacks as we get further and further away from the season. So I would not indicate that there's going to be a massive rise here for Shedeur or Cam Ward, but that's where we're at. As of now, they would technically, given the parameters that I said in this video that I think are fair, be reaches. And that is the history of reaching for a quarterback. You can argue about how you need a quarterback, how you need to draft one, but that mindset has not produced a ton of franchise quarterbacks. Matter of fact, I find it hard to find an example of that mindset ever producing a franchise quarterback, especially if we're talking about taking one in the top 5, which the Browns are. That's my piece. Let me know what you think. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.